Is Adrienne Esposito. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. Thank you for joining us. This is our second Whale Tales and Whale Facts Forum, provided to all of you to continue to give facts and education on what is happening with one of the most beloved creatures on Earth, which is the whale population. Why? Because facts and science actually really do matter. And we have wonderful presenters today. I just want to say we're delighted to have with us Dr. Marianne McNamara. Dr. Marinaka is the Vice President and Naturalist at Cresley. She's also a professor at Suffolk County Community College. We also have Rob DiGiovanni. Rob is the Chief Scientist and Executive Director of the Atlantic States Marine Conservation Society. And also, who'll be joining the panel, we're also delighted to have Dr. Arthur Koppelman. Artie, as we like to call him, is the Executive Director of Cresley. Artie's organization, Cresley, runs the whale watches out of Montauk. So if you've ever been on a whale watching tour, you've probably met Artie or been on one of his excessively educational and fun and magical tours that they run. They are really, they do so much to educate the public, but also to allow the public to understand how we can see whales, appreciate whales without harming whales. So the purpose of today is to get out the facts. There's a lot of myths out there, but we will be dispelling the myths. The truth is, as many of you may know, that the unusual whale mortality event that has been declared in the United States started in 2016. You should know that was way before there was any exploration on the bottomlands for offshore wind. So this whale mortality event, where whales are washing up dead, mostly for humpbacks, but some for minke and other whales, is really something that needs to be explored. We need to understand what is happening. And we need to do that so that we can really craft policies and make plans to protect whales and save whales. Because if you really care about whales, you want the truth. And what gets us the truth are the facts and the science of what is impacting the whale population. And now to start us off, we have Dr. Marianne McNamara, and we're delighted to have you. So I'm turning it over to you, Marianne.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here, and hopefully this will pop up. We'll get this on PowerPoint. Slideshow, everybody see that? Adrienne, you see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank
Perfect.
you. And Rob.
Good job.
So thank you for having me. And as Adrienne mentioned, I'm Dr. Marianne McNamara. I'm a professor of biology and marine biology at Suffolk County Community College. I'm also the vice president and naturalist with Cresley. And I'm going to be presenting work that's been conducted alongside Dr. Artie Koppelman, who is the president and one of the co-founders of Cresley, without whom none of this would be possible. So let's begin. First off, to tell you what Cresley stands for. Cresley stands for the Coastal Research and Education Society of Long Island. Our mission is to promote and foster a lifelong understanding and appreciation of our coastal ecosystems through both research and education. And this is accomplished primarily through seasonal seal walks and cruises, and of course, whale watches, which is what I'll be speaking to today. The seal walks occur down at in West Hampton along Cupsog Beach, and the cruises depart Southampton into Shinnecock Bay. Both of these occur during winter and spring months. They're ongoing right now. And then the whale watches depart out of Montauk, New York, during our summer months. In fact, Cresley has been operating whale watch tours out of Montauk in conjunction with the Viking fleet since 1996. And this represents well over 20 years of observational data. You can see in those years that are posted there that there's a 6-year gap between 2003 and 2008. And this is during a time when the whales were just too far offshore to be reasonably reached within a time frame for a daily trip. Cresley did still conduct offshore overnight trips into the Great South Channel to our north, but those daily trips resumed in 2009 to the present, culminating in 16 years worth of data. And because these trips occur across consistent time and spatial frames relatively over these many years, it makes it ripe for scientific investigations. So one thing I want to emphasize is that not all whale watches are created equal. At Cresley, we seasonally train a team of dedicated citizen science volunteers to come on board with us and help us collect data. And they do so on GPS-enabled tablets. So anytime we're with a cetacean, that is a whale or a dolphin, we record and document the location, the latitude and longitude, so we know exactly where that encounter occurred. We also record the sea surface temperature, the water depth. We're able to use the sonar on board these vessels to determine prey abundance, whether it's high or low or none, as well as distribution in the water column. Sometimes we're able to determine type as well. Someone will be using a stopwatch to record our dive intervals of our diving and then surfacing whales. And then we record a lot of other points of data, including behavior. Are the whales breaching? Are they feeding? If they're feeding, what types of techniques are they using? Are there any associations? For example, are there mom and calf pairs? What else is going on, right? Are there birds of interest? Are there sea turtles, sharks, tuna, marine debris, fishing activity, and the like? So we collect a tremendous amount of data aboard each one of our trips. And in addition to that, we also collect a tremendous amount of photographs. And these photographs are not just to take pretty pictures and post onto social media, although we do. These are to photo identify our whales. So it's not enough for us to just say, hey, this is a humpback whale. We want to know which humpback whale this is. And that is very important because it helps prevent redundancy in our sightings data. So we might see the same whale within the same trip. We might see that same whale across multiple trips in a season or across multiple years. And that gives us a lot of important information on habitat usage and site fidelity. So it's very important and also non-invasive, very passively acquired data. Many people ask us if we tag the whales. Others do. We do not. We simply use our cameras as our scientific tool. So I'm going to explain to you how this is done. If you look at this very stereotypical picture of a diving humpback whale, if we're in the right position, we can get a look at the underside of the humpback whale's tail flukes. And the underside, or what we call the ventral surface, is going to have differences in pigmentation from whale to whale. So a humpback whale's tail will range on the underside from all white to all black, with every possible variation in between, including differences not only in pigmentation, but also scarring. And that is unique to every individual humpback. If you follow that yellow line, that is what we call the trailing edge of the tail. That's also unique. You might notice little peaks and valleys and nooks and crannies and ridges. That is also unique for every whale. So that tail fluke acts like a human fingerprint, and we can identify a whale individually, and then we can determine whether or not we've encountered that individual before. So every whale that we do encounter and photo identify gets an MTK number and goes into our Montauk Humpback Whale Catalog. And this is not unique. There are many other organizations that do this. So we collaborate with these other regional and local curators of similar catalogs. For example, in the Gulf of Maine, a very important and significant feeding ground for the humpbacks, there's a very extensive catalog of those whales that's curated by the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And so it helps us when we share our data to determine, is this a whale that's been previously seen in the Gulf of Maine? Also, the New York City Humpback Whale Catalog that's curated by Gotham Whale and many others. So all of this is a very wonderful way of sharing this data and determining what's going on with these humpback whale populations. And for us, it also helps us determine how many whales we're seeing with a really good sense of reliability of our numbers. So for example, what you're seeing here is a figure representing 15 years worth of data from 2009 to 2023. And these are just the fluke identified humpbacks. So no redundancy. These are individual humpback whales. There's more than this that we see. We just don't always get that fluke shot. We can't always say, that it was a different whale than the others. And so these are nice conservative numbers. But what you're seeing is if you look at, around 2017 onward, there is an above average number of humpback whales being documented off of Montauk. And that is a trend that continues. It varies interannually. So year to year, you're seeing some differences, but you're seeing since 2017, this above average. And that culminates in this high in 2023, where we documented 47 unique humpbacks And what about 2024, right? Our most recent season. Well, if I include 2024, that bar is going to shoot through the top of my computer screen and hover about 2 or 3 feet over my laptop, because 2024 is going to require me to reset that entire y-axis scale. And what you're seeing here is now the last 16 years worth, where our new record high was this past season with 122 individually documented humpback whales, almost 3 times as many whales. And this was very anomalous. I do want to note, however, it's very important to understand that we go out a different number of trips every year. So we try to keep things relatively constant, but some years due to scheduling, there's more or less trips. Some years there's weather cancellations and so forth. So for 2024, we actually doubled the number of our trips, but we had almost 3 times as many whales. So we have to adjust this and look at this per unit effort. And that will bring down that anomaly of 2024 just a bit. It's still very significant. In 2024, when we look at how many humpbacks we encountered per hour, what we see is a little more than a third more humpbacks in 2024 relative to our previous high, which is still tracking as the previous highest in 2023. And if we relate this and add trend lines, it's actually very similar to the raw data, which is super interesting for us. Means we're doing something right. But this is important to adjust for the effort, just to tell the full story. The full story, though, also includes a bit about where these whales were encountered last season. What you're looking at here is a map showing the distribution of all of our humpback whale encounters over these past 16 years. What you're seeing is, of course, that southeastern tip of the South Shore of Long Island. That's Montauk Point there. Just to the far top right would be Block Island. And this is showing you all of the humpbacks we have documented aboard Cresley, local daily trips during the summer months. And the circles are representing the number of individuals by both size and color. So 2 things showing you the same thing, whereas those little dots are likely just an individual, maybe a pair of humpback whales, especially near shore within that 20 fathom line. And then where you see those larger circles, especially the black large circles, this is where we've had upwards of 2 to 3 dozen humpback whales. And what I want to show you here is this is representing 16 years worth of data. I'm going to remove the first 15 just to focus on 2024. And when I do that, it's still an incredibly large number of humpbacks. I'm going to show you that one more time. These are all of our years, all the years worth of data. If we look at that offshore region of whales, it represents about 278 or so square miles of area, whereas in 2024, we've got about 52 square miles, where almost all of our humpback encounters were. Almost half of our entire catalog of humpbacks actually were documented in the summer of 2024. So this is very significant. We could routinely go 8 to 12 miles southwest out of Montauk and encounter these large aggregations of humpback whales. So what's going on, right? Again, we have this photo identification data and we have collaboration with other regions. So we wanted to see, maybe these whales are coming in from another area where they haven't been from, before. What's going on? So when we look at 2022, we had a little more than 90% of our whales off Montauk previously identified within the Gulf of Maine to our north or within the New York Bight. The New York Bight is the region that represents the body of water from the tip of Montauk down like a triangle to the tip of New Jersey at Cape May. And that is an area that also has identifications going on. And so we found 90% of our whales in 2022, either just to our north or to our west and south previously. When we look at 2023, very similar, 86.3%. So far, when we've been doing our matches, we've matched 87% of all of our humpbacks off of Montauk to the Gulf of Maine and the New York City catalog, including New Jersey. And so there's not really a difference in the percentage, right? The distribution of whales and where these whales are coming from. The number is higher, but not necessarily the story about where they're coming from. And I want to point out that This is particularly interesting because a little more than a quarter of the humpbacks that we did find and identify off of Montauk this season had previously been documented by ourselves. About half over 2 years, meaning in 2024 and possibly the year before, possibly 2009, right? Any two of our 16-year time span, but almost 42% were documented over 3 years. So many of these whales are repeats, right? They're loyal customers. They've been to our waters before and they've returned. This particular whale that's pictured here, this was on my last trip of the season, was breaching right off to the side. We actually had a couple get engaged on this trip while this whale was breaching. This is a whale that has been documented over 5 years in that 16-year time span. And we have one that's been documented not only over 6 years, but over the last 6 years. So there's a bit of significance here to these whales coming here and coming back. The other part of the story is that the whales came and stayed, right? So it's not just that we had more whales and they were in this very, sort of densely populated area. We had whales returning from previous years, and the whales that did come here stayed. The average residency time, what is an observational period from the first sighting to our last sighting, rose from what was about 18 days in 2023, almost doubling, right, to almost 40 days in 2024. And that the 2023 was even higher than the 6 years prior to that, or the 5 years and the year itself average at 16.6 days. We had no resightings of whales within the same season prior to 2018. So this is a trend that seems to be increasing. And I want to point out a couple of examples here. At the top and bottom of your screen, we have 2 mom-calf pairs. They're one of 7 mom-calf pairs we documented off of Montauk this past summer. And these were mom-calf pairs that stuck around. It wasn't just that we saw them, let's say, at the start of July and then, at the end of our season into September. These were whales that we saw repeatedly. Angus and her calf that you see at the top, we saw on almost every trip. So they were here and they were sticking around and eating, and these are nursing, very hungry mom whales. So that tells a really important story. And the others, right, about half of the residency times ranged from at least 19 days upwards to 62, and 1/3 equaled or exceeded 1 month. That's very telling, right? So the whales were here and they stayed. Why, right? Why were they doing this? Well, as I mentioned, we document and take a lot of data while we're on board these trips. And these whales were feeding on every single trip that we documented the humpbacks, and a variety of feeding: kick feeding, cooperative bubble net feeding, individual bubble cloud feeding, lunge feeding, and even subsurface feeding. How do we know that they're feeding beneath the surface? They come up and they poop, and they go back down and they come up and they poop again. And it's a sign for us that the whales are feeding when they do that. And this occurred on every trip. And here's why, right? The number of sand eels that were off of Montauk this season was incredibly high. We encountered, mainly through photo investigation, because this is a small fish species, after the fact, but we encountered a large number of feeding techniques on sand eels and documented the sand eels in our water. And since we work with the Viking fleet, they also were able to mention to us the abundance of sand eels off of Montauk this summer. So to kind of summarize what was going on, we had more humpbacks that occurred and remained off of Montauk, New York this past season than in any year since our photo identification efforts began in 2009. And remember, that was following a 6-year gap where we couldn't even find these whales. Not only humpbacks, but all the other whales were just too far offshore. So things are absolutely changing in our waters. And it's these documentations of feeding behavior that is combined with this extended residency, suggesting that the availability of prey off of the southeastern tip of Long Island was at least partially responsible for the increase in numbers relative to previous years. And I do want to add that this is a population of whales that is recovering. The whales off of Montauk are part of the West Indies breeding stock. That is a population that was removed off the endangered species list in 2016. They're still protected, thankfully, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but their numbers are increasing. The last season, of course, was a bit of an anomaly, but we do know that the whales are recovering very thankfully, not without their threats, as you'll hear from Rob in just a moment. But for our part of the story, I really want to make an emphasis that This highlights the significance and the importance of the New York Bight as a seasonal feeding habitat for the species. And that could very well supplement more traditional feeding grounds, such as the Gulf of Maine and elsewhere, especially if those areas are experiencing any declines or changes in their own, what would otherwise be a dependable prey species. So none of this occurs in a vacuum. There's many people to acknowledge and thank, certainly the volunteers that have come out with us on our trips. If you're interested in doing so, by all means, please check out our website, but also the Viking Fleet, which has always adhered to strict, very responsible whale watching, ethical and responsible whale watching guidelines, but also all the curators of these catalogs, including Center for Coastal Studies, Gotham Whale, the Thorn Lab at Stony Brook University, and many others. So I hope I have left myself enough time to answer questions. I'll leave you here with the ability to scan this QR code. You can get access to a digital copy of our Marine Mammal Identification Guide. I've included my email as well as Dr. Artie Popelman's in case you have any follow-up questions. But please, if you have any, let me know, and hopefully I'll be able to answer them for you.
We'll be taking questions and answers after the next speaker, but thank you so
All
much.
right.
So Dr. McNamara, I just want to say, so the information about the sand eels, that's new data, right? I don't remember ever hearing that before.
We get most of ours is anecdotal from working. We visually see it. We always see sand eels. I don't want to say always on every trip, but through the seasons we've seen the whales feeding on sand eels. So them being here isn't necessarily new. What was new is that we were going to the same area, within this relatively small mileage, and the whales were consistently feeding for 3 months on these sand eels. And it's something that the Viking Fleet had noted they were finding in the guts of the fish that they were bringing on board their fishing trips. And so the sand eels is a big part of the story here, for sure.
Right. So yeah, that's what I meant, that there's so many more sand eels here,
Right.
it seems, which is creating more food for the whales, which then in turn brings more whales.
Right,
So
especially humpbacks. Yeah, definitely a favored
yes,
prey for humpbacks.
like chocolate and humans. So,
Right.
all right. Thank you
Can
so
I
much.
jump in for a sec? Also,
Yes, of course.
near shore,
Yeah.
tremendous numbers of menhaden, Atlantic menhaden, and those numbers really didn't start showing up significantly until about 2016.
Yeah.
And near shore are where the young, not the mom calves, but the juveniles, the young ones, the ones that really don't know much yet, but they're feeding near shore on Atlantic menhaden.
Thank you, Audie. Okay.
I will go ahead and stop sharing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Rob DiGiovanni. Rob, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. Can you see my slides okay?
Yeah, I just want to make a little commercial announcement for the anti-wind people who are on here typing silly things in the Q&A. I think your time would be much better spent if you actually listened to the experts, because then you'll actually learn something. So go ahead, Rob. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thanks, Marianne, for that presentation. It really sets up the stage for a lot of the changes that are going on. I'm Rob DiGiovanni. I'm with the Atlantic Marine Conservation Society. I've been working with marine mammals and sea turtles for over 30 years. Artie and I started together back in the Okeanos days when the only whale watch was being run out of Montauk. And there was always a difference of saying, hey, we can go to New England and see more whales. And that's obviously changed because you have a lot of these animals here. And that's really what we're always been looking at is what are we seeing and what animals are we encountering from not only sighting them on the waters, but also washing up on our beaches. Just to give you a little bit about Atlantic Marine Conservation Society. Sorry, we don't just do stranding response. We do that as well, but we do education and outreach. We do conservation research. So we study turtles and seals as well. We do a lot of tracking work with that. I do aerial surveys to go out and count, whether it be seals or sea turtles or even whales and dolphins. And we do that. And I always joke that Artie and I kind of paths separated when he was on the boat and I got off the boat to get into the air to go see. And that year when you had that big void in seeing animals was when We started way back when I was at Riverhead Foundation in 2004, 2005, conducting aerial surveys in the New York Bight, which was the first time that it was actually having surveys go all the way to the Jersey Shore. And we were seeing animals, about 30 or 35 miles, I say about 30 minutes off our flight line. So that was pretty far offshore that we were seeing. I mean, my joke was I saw the whales, and then 10 minutes later, I saw Artie on his boat, and I was just like, there's no way you're going to get out there to where those animals are. And that's really a big part of the story is what are those animals doing? And when they come closer to shore, what are the challenges that they face? We also we're in West Hampton Beach, so we're right down the road from where those wildfires were a week or so ago. Our facility was 0.6 of a mile from there, and we actually have a critical care facility for sea turtles that we spun up. We have 14 endangered Kemp's Ridley sea turtles that are undergoing care at our facility right now. Big thing is we're trying to actually always go out and document what you're seeing, and I think there's a very big part of this that I heard even listening to Marianne's talk is that you have 6 whale catalogs that are going on now, whereas you only really had 1 30 years ago. So you have a lot more effort that's out there. So you're going to see an increase. You see some of these populations are basically increasing or being delisted. So those are all some of the changes that we have to account for. And so that goes right into what happened, trying to share this information as much as we can. But this is an animal that back in April of 2017, when we started Atlantic Marine Conservation Society, it was more in response to understanding that we're seeing more and more large whales, and we need to start seeing that, talking about that trend. Prior to 2007, whale strandings in the New York Bight were infrequent enough that the longest duration between events was 619 days. And then starting in 2016, 2017, that frequency started to decrease. At one point, it was about every 60 days. Then it went down to even as frequently as every 23 to 14 days. So there's obviously variability, but it was also happening concurrently with seeing this. We're going to show you a line graph in a bit that's going to give you some idea of the numbers that we could talk about, but you might want to keep in mind some of this is looking at what Dr. McNamara actually put out earlier, looking at the occurrence of these animals. What I want to note here is that this is us doing an investigation. This is in the Rockaways. This is where we started to see animals farther west on the island, where normally we would see them on the east end. This is a humpback whale. This is us conducting it. We go out and we conduct an examination, the same for every whale. And we try to do that as best as we can based on the condition of the animal and the resources that are available. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But what we did look at is the trend that we see with whales going back to the 80s. If you can see my cursor, you had few animals coming in here and they stayed below 5 animals. And then back around 2015, 2016, you started to see this upward trend. And then you can see that we're kind of pacing what our 3-year rolling average might have been for whale strandings. And we understood that trend was occurring. What's important to note here is that all whales are not necessarily the same. I think we saw a number of images of humpback whales, but there are a number of species that we encounter here, not just humpback whales. We see minke whales, we see fin whales, we see sei whales, we see right whales as well. So when we look at strandings and we use the term whale, it has a number of different animals that are involved in that. But to kind of look at this, we know that we saw a peak here. We saw a decrease, obviously, in 2020 and 2021, maybe this decrease in effort that was out there, or just decrease in reporting, decrease in any other activity. But we did see a big spike in 2023. 2024, we've seen fewer animals, and we've kind of gone back to that 13 or so whale average that we have in the New York Bight. And I point that out. I want to make sure we're clear. We would rather never have to go out and do a whale necropsy. I'd much rather go out on a whale watch and see whales. But when we go out, we are able to at least collect some information about what's going on with these animals. And I just wanted to give a little bit of an update from stranding records. If you look at these heat maps, and we just didn't update it with 2024 on the right one, but if you look at the left, this is from 2000 to 2006, and it shows that a majority of the animals that you saw, I mean, we saw them up and down the coast where strandings would occur, but you saw more around New England, which kind of coincides with what we were seeing with whale sightings and whale watching and the things that you just heard in the previous talk. But starting in 2016 to 2023, you started to see more of this area heat up in the mid-Atlantic. and actually in the upper New York Bight area. So you started to see animals that were closer to the Jersey Shore. You have groups like Gotham Whale that are actually doing whale watching out of Western Long Island, which would indicate that you have more animals there. One thing that I used to encounter when we would go out on a whale stranding, back in 15 or 20 years ago, most people weren't even aware that whales were here. They said, I had no idea whales were here. I used to ask them, did you hear about Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Port or Amagansett or Sag Harbor? And they're like, yeah, we did. I said, well, do you think they put those ports where whales were not at one point? I mean, whales were here and we knew that we had them. The numbers have changed and their movements have changed, which means that we're going to be seeing them in different places. And that's probably what we were seeing for many years. I think it's important to note right here that, and Artie can correct me if I'm wrong, but when we were doing whale watches earlier in the 80s and 90s, we were seeing a lot more fin whales than we were seeing humpback whales. Now we're seeing humpback whales as well, more minke whales. So we're seeing more species of whales, which then also increases to the number. So it's kind of a interesting trend to see that this is an area that's coming up. When we conduct a necropsy, we try to investigate causes of mortality. There's a couple of phases to that. One is what we consider the gross necropsy, not just because it's gross, but in the sense that you're looking at the external findings of the animal, you collect tissues, and then you come up with what you think you're seeing from the field. We usually post these at different points throughout the year. I don't expect anybody to read this. There's not necessarily a test later, but it giving you an idea of what animals we saw, when we saw them coming up, what their general locations were, and keeping in mind that we're usually very conservative in our assessment about what these are. So we'll say, this is what we see. We see bruising, we see broken bones, or see something along those lines. And then we also send those data out to a pathologist that will review the slides or the histopathology and work with a much larger investigative team, not necessarily just us. And so it's really important to understand that this is a much larger process when we're dealing with this. You can see that we have the table for 2023 and 2024, giving you an idea of what we're seeing. What I wanted to note on the table of 2023, it was a busier year. It was also a year where we had more reports of animals that were farther offshore and were not able to be investigated. So we're talking about animals that are maybe 30 to 50 miles offshore and don't actually make landfall. And it's important to note that because one of the challenges you have is that we don't know what we don't see that's out there. So strandings are a representation of what's going on, but it's not the high-end number. It's probably just a cross-section of what's going on. And we do find a cross-section of causes. In many cases, you can find something, and in some cases you can't. Just giving you an idea of the effort that has to go into that. Here's an example of us moving an animal. We worked with our colleagues in the Marine Mammal Stranding Center in New Jersey, and there was no place to actually dispose of the animal. It couldn't be buried on the beach. So they had to use all this equipment to try and put it on a flatbed to move it off site so we can conduct a necropsy. You can see the other two pictures, the effort that's put in. We need heavy equipment in order to move the animals. And it's important to note here that all of these animals that we looked at, in some cases, don't have external signs of injury or causes for mortality, but the process by which we undergo the investigation is still the same. It is important to note that one of the things that we see, we were talking about younger animals, we're usually seeing animals about 30 feet in length for humpback whales. When we saw fin whales, they were much larger, and I'll talk about that in a second. But to kind of give a summary, and this is just basic, I'm sorry, it's just a table, but looking at what we've seen since way back I say way back in 2016, 2017, Atlantic Marine Conservation Society has responded to about 115 whales in the New York Bight and in a little bit surrounding waters. We also work with our colleagues in Connecticut. Of those animals, 34% were minke whales, and of them, 51% were humpback whales. A small percentage were fin whales, but you're also seeing that there's a difference in the code. And to put the code in perspective, a code 1 animal is an animal that's alive. Code 2 is an animal that is what they call freshly dead or just died. So it's in relatively good conditions. So when you do the examination, you'll be able to see a lot more of the internal organs. But you might notice here from this is that majority of the animals we get are code 3 and 4, which are really severely decomposed. and in many cases might not be investigated in other areas just because of the overall condition. And trying not to make this gross, that's what this left bottom picture is all about, is showing this is a fin whale that washed up at Cupsog Beach, and it is severely decomposed. Upon being able to bring it up onto the beach, we were able to find broken bones at the base of the skull. So it is an animal that's suspect vessel strike, but it's really not a lot of other information that was there. So in some cases, these animals would not even have been investigated, but this animal in and of itself was a 62-foot long female. So this is a big animal, talking about the effort that has to go into doing this and then finally bringing it up once again using excavators. Of the animals that we did, were able to conduct examinations on or be able to determine factors that might contribute to the mortality, we have 3 categories here: human interaction, yes, no, or CBD. CBD means that either we were not able to examine the animal or there was not enough information to draw any conclusion from that. And you can see that if there's a large category of we can't be determined, but there's also a large category of animals that have HI. HI would include anything from vessel strike, ingestion debris, entanglement, or even harassment that could be part of that. So it's, once again, big categories being broken down. This would be the part where we want to talk a little bit about what really was changing in 2016 that Adrian mentioned at the beginning. There's an unusual mortality event, which by nature is saying that we have an unusual number or an increase in animals that have exceeded either 2 standard deviations beyond the previous year's averages, or it's in a place where we normally don't have whales, or a combination of any of those. And so there's a working group that actually evaluates these data that's submitted, and then determines, yes, that this does appear to be an unusual mortality event. And starting back in 2016, 2017 is when we had an unusual mortality event declared for the Minke whale, the humpback whale, and the North Atlantic right whale. So right there, you have 3 different species that are undergoing an unusual mortality event. And in looking at that, just giving you an idea, and these are data that you could actually get from the NOAA Fisheries website. I mean, we can definitely post these links if people want them. Pretty straightforward. They have interactive maps where you can see where these animals are occurring in the distributions. But you can see that prior to the unusual mortality event for humpback whales here, you can see what the number was, and there was variability. Some years you had, over 20, and some years you were down below 10. But consistently, outside of the 2020 event that we had, they were continuously high. And that being continuously high is looking up and down the coast from Maine to Florida. And so when we look at that, that's the same for humpbacks. It's similar for minke whales, but it's very important to note here that these 2 animals are stranding for 2 very different reasons. The humpback whale, we are seeing a number of problems. We're seeing a lot of undetermined, or we're also seeing vessel strikes as being a cause. We have seen evidence of entanglement, but the minke whale itself seems to be stranding for a reason more biological, so more of an encephalitis, so it's more of a disease process. So it's something that's totally not related to what the other conditions are, but it's still important to examine them. What's been one of the odd benefits that we have is this is a species that we've also seen a number of animals strand alive with odd neurological behavior, and so we were able to get very good samples to be able to investigate that a lot more closely. All of this being laid over the point that when we look at this, please don't say, when I say, we had 14 animals last year, we had 14 humpback whales come up, and Dr. McNamara was talking about seeing 120 new species off of Montauk, not the new species, but new individuals off of Montauk. Then you're also talking about what are we seeing in the work that Stony Brook's doing, or the work that Gotham's Whale doing. So you are seeing more animals, and if there's is a change in their feed source, we need to look at that percentage of strandings over time, and we're starting to move towards a time when we actually have pretty decent data going forward, because there's consistent work out there that you can work out, as Dr. Wow, I've just messed up your name. Sorry about that. But as we were just seeing, like the catch per unit effort work, so you understand how much effort's going out there, so you can kind of normalize some of those data. That being said, we know that the North Atlantic right whale is endangered. We can see that there's an estimated 370 animals that are here. We can see the fluctuations in the bottom here showing numbers of animals that were estimated from deaths and the number of offspring. So this is a challenge, but we're only going to get at some of these numbers by investigating these animals. Many of us don't remember in July of 2020 when we had the entangled humpback whale in upper New York Bight. This is an animal that we knew it was entangled for at least 4 days, had 3,900 pounds of gear on the back. Group from the Center for Coastal Studies came out and was able to disentangle that animal. And Cresley was able to see that animal months later and years later that it did kind of move through this area. So looking at this, when we talk about having animals that are going to have a lot more residency time here, we're looking at animals that are navigating their environment. We have a lot of other factors that are navigating those environments. We're going to have co-occurrences. What we're trying to assess is, are these co-occurrences becoming disproportionate to this? And I have to, whoops, and we showed that slide. This is a summary slide with what we had, giving you an idea of the 114, 115 animals. Still needs to be updated a little bit. Sorry, 23 of them were alive. Only 78 have had necropsies conducted. Of the 78, 45 had evidence of human interaction. Remember that broad category. And 32 were suspect vessel strikes. And we understand that that's a little bit more towards the humpback whale or the right whale is what we're seeing in those. In some cases with the vessel strike for the right whale, it was actually even called in by a ship. Just to summarize something, and this is all about where we're getting information from, how much information. In 2024, we had, of these animals that came up, we had 7 Minke whales, 6 were possible infectious disease that were sent out. One we were not able to determine the cause of death. We had 3 humpbacks. One was free swimming that you might have heard of in Sloop Channel. One was a vessel strike and one was undetermined. We also had fin whales working with our colleagues in Rhode Island. One was alive and the other one was the one we spoke of that was off of Cupsog floating offshore. And then we had one sei whale that came in on the bow of a cruise ship. And it came into New York Harbor. So sei whales are not normally seen. And I say that because they're difficult to see. They kind of behave a little bit differently. But once again, that's what makes up. We have 4 different species of whales that we're encountering here for different reasons in our harbor. Looking at the effort, this is the sei whale. It was a 44-foot long fin whale that had to be towed in to Sandy Hook for us to conduct the necropsy. We worked with our partners up and down the coast to be able to do this. And then one other case that I want to really highlight here, and this is where we're learning a lot more about these animals, is here's an animal that in 2023 in May was floating offshore, and it was reported east of Shinnecock. And within 2 days, it actually got close enough to shore and actually went through Shinnecock Inlet. We had to tow that animal back out in order to be able to conduct the necropsy. But you can note here, I'm sorry if this picture is too graphic for you. I should have probably put the disclaimer a little bit sooner. But many of these animals are severely decomposed. They have predation on them. But once again, we are seeing them that they're floating in from near shore, but the ones that are offshore will not necessarily be ones that we see. When all but the right whale, when these whales die, they will usually sink. And then when they start to decompose, they'll off gas and they'll float up. That's how they end up on shore here. The right whale, because of its blubber content in the oil, will actually float when it's dead. So you have more of a chance of seeing that animal or encountering that animal. And believe it or not, there is an end to this. And because I never want to end on a negative, this is really what's different when you, well, for me anyway, from going out and seeing whales back in the day. Seeing whales swimming, this is right off of Long Beach, where one of the photos that I took when I went out on a project with Whale and Conservation Society. But you're seeing feeding here and you're seeing animals that are here. The one thing that you need to put into your mind is that when you're seeing animals closer to shore, they've done a lot of things, which is they've come closer to shore where we're all encountering them. So being aware that these animals are around and, looking at groups like the Viking Fleet that are doing a great job to make sure that they stay away from these animals and give them their space, that's a key component in trying to protect that. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have fabulous questions in the chat. So let's do this kind of quickly. I'll start off. I'm joined by my colleague, Maureen Murphy from Citizens Campaign for the Environment. But we have a lot of questions about the role that the increased population of menhaden or bunkerfish, as we all affectionately call them, is having on increased whale populations off of the South Shore. Will one of you take that question?
Yeah, myself or Artie.
Yeah, I think we both can. The studies are been clear, and this is from the work of Julia Stepanek, that near shore is where we find young or juvenile humpbacks. They are less than 12 meters in length or less than 39 feet in length, and they are predominantly feeding on bunker. And just the behavior of bunker, because it sort of swims in tight circles anyway, they don't have to expend a lot of energy to concentrate them. And we started seeing, at least out in eastern Long Island, a tremendous increase in bunkers somewhere around 2016. In fact, talking to my colleagues in the Viking fleet, they said they rarely before then saw a bunker out of Montauk. And that correlates well with our studies, where we were finding for all these years, even this summer, lots of juvenile humpbacks near shore feeding on menhaden, whereas the older ones would be further offshore. And it's unfortunate that they're near shores where a lot of the boats are, and where folks are going really fast sometimes when they shouldn't be going. They're not keeping their eyes out, and they will occasionally disturb and or hit whales.
Before we move on to the next one, the other question or part of that, actually, I guess this is the next one. I'm sorry. So there are questions in the queue about how, and I know it's sometimes hard for people to understand this, how do these cargo ships not see the whale? How come they hit them? Can you guys comment on that, please?
Yeah, I could definitely talk about that because these cargo ships, they're the Panamax, they're the mega ones. When they raised the Bayonne Bridge a number of years ago, and then New York became the busiest port in the nation, you had this perfect storm of events where, the ship is 1,000 feet plus in length and the engines are in the rear. So there's literally an acoustic void that is ahead of that ship. And the whale's they've done studies, the whales will hear that ship for about 2 hours before it would come close enough to hit them. Then as it's getting close, if the whale does go in front of the ship, it doesn't hear those engines anymore because you have 1,000 feet of ship, right? That's now blocking and muting out that sound. There's also the idea that many, like Artie said, many of these whales are young, they're inexperienced, and they're also outside of orca. What do they have to fear? They're a whale, right? So I would say you got to think like a whale. You're hearing this noise. It's an urban ocean here. So, you're hearing so much noise, you might not necessarily think, when a whale is feeding, it's like me, like I wish Joe get out of my way, I'm hungry, like the whale's there to feed, and they're hearing all this noise anyway. And there is something to be considered that it does get quiet when they're right in head of that ship, and they just can't turn on a dime. So, like we always say, no one wants to hit a whale, right? Like these captains certainly don't want to, hit a whale and deal with the consequences and paperwork and just the morality of it. But they're not going to see them, and so it's really more about these, smaller craft, really, especially very close to shore, that can be problematic in very turbid, murky water, that the bunker are moving, the whales are moving with them. Lunge feeding, I refer to as violent, right? It's a sort of like violent process, and the whales pop up and you can't necessarily predict that. I mean, I've seen video where a boat was sitting still fishing, engines off, and a whale bumped into it, right? I mean, and no fault of the boater, and this happens, and it could be very damaging, especially to a young whale. And that happening repeatedly can be a problem. So I always try to explain that so people understand, it's easier than
that was extremely informative. Thank you. Maureen?
And Marianne, you alluded to this though, but we have been, Amazon shopping now like crazy. Are we seeing an increase in these big ships into the port? And is that impacting the ship strikes? And is that having an impact on the whales?
Yeah, Gotham Whale does a lot with this. So I'm piggybacking on some of the things I've seen through them. And I recommend people check out the Gotham Whale website because they have publications on this. But I give a presentation, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but prior to, I think it was 2021, when the Bayonne Bridge hadn't yet been raised, there were only a handful, a dozen or so of these very large, supersized, tanker vessels that had come through. And then since then, you know, we're seeing scores and scores and scores every year. So yes, absolutely yes. And you could see it. You at a Long Beach, you just see the, you know, the row of them all lined up. I've been on whale watches out from there, and I've seen it myself. We're passing these tanker vessels, and yes, absolutely. In terms of bunker traffic, and it did, like that labor strike that went on out in Long Beach, combined with just the general nature of shopping habits and the pandemic, perfect storm. We became the busiest port, you know, back in, what was it, 2022, 23, the fall, I forget which year. And yeah, there's the Gotham Whale does a great job of showing a map of the vessel traffic. I think this was someone's comment in the Q&A, and it overlaps completely with the sightings detail of the humpback whales. They're Paul C. Where used to say the whales are playing in traffic, right? And they are. I mean, we're sharing the same water.
Okay, great. Just a quick question here. This is a yes or no. Each three of you can answer this, by John Weber. Is it possible, and is it so simple, that many more whales are dying more than normal because there are more whales living? Increased numbers mean increased death.
Yes.
I think this perhaps, but I don't think it's going to ever be that simple. But yeah,
I knew you were going to
more
say that, Arnie.
whales, with more whales, there'll be more deaths. But the question, I think, is the deaths, are they avoidable? And that's where we have to kind of direct our efforts. So yes and no.
Yeah, and
Okay.
just to try and piggyback on that is that I we know we're not going to get a short answer because it goes from, you know, Artie to me, but I think that the challenge is that making people aware and understanding that, you know, even if you are going to encounter a whale, you know, going slower is better to begin with, and being aware that these animals are here and making sure you're monitoring it. You know, the previous question was about why don't they know, but the sei whale that came on the bow of the cruise ship was reported when they were docking, that they said, hey, you know, you have a whale on the bow of your ship. They are very large. So really, it's a big part of this is being aware that these animals are around, and making sure. I always use the example, you know, when you're going by a school or playground, you slow down, you just pay it. There's a lot going on in our waters. I mean, now when I go out to conduct an investigation, or our team goes out, more often than not, we're actually seeing other whales swimming in the area. So, you know, that's really something that's very different, and understanding that you have other vessels, being aware of that, making sure that we put in basic even policy regulations to say, you know, you should be able to be aware, making sure boaters know across the board that this is something that is not an anomaly anymore.
And talking about boaters, let's talk about whale harassment. There is a couple of questions here about, you know, what is whale harassment? And if you see it out on the water, who do you report that to?
So
Yeah, I just want to thank Stephanie for that question. We get that question at the office too. People call us. You know, a lot of boaters, they want to get that great picture, but they're following the whale and harassing it. What can they do? Who do they call?
So I'm going to try and take a
Good.
jump at this, but first of all, harassment has a lot of different categories. Harassment is basically, do you change the behavior of the animal? I mean, that could be considered harassment. HI, when we look at human interaction, and, you know, the animal, did it hit a vessel? So they're all those levels. The basic one that I think we're talking about is when you see a whale and you want to get close to it, and it decides it's going to try, you can't find it. Bottom line is, you see a whale, you should stop in the water, just see what the animal's going to do, let it go. Getting closer to an animal, especially if it's, you know, protected marine mammal, 50 yards is really what the regulations suggest you stay away. It's much larger for a right whale. So until you know what the animals are, you should stay away. People have asked me, could a whale or a seal hurt me? You know, if I encounter it, or a dolphin. And I said, well, if you are 50 yards away, no. So if you're staying away from that animal, give it its room. If you see any type of harassment, you can call NOAA Fisheries. They have Office of Law Enforcement. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation also connects with them to say, okay, what do we see? You can call the New York State Stranding Hotline, and then we can kind of get all the people involved that are doing that. I think the biggest thing, though, is we really just want people to not do that. Just don't harass the animal. Just stay back, observe them from a distance. It's not about saying, hey, we want to catch you doing this. It's more about, hey, let the animal do what it's going to do. I mean, when I look at this and when we look at the sloop channel whale, we had the humpback in a small channel. Our biggest concern was just keeping people and boats away from the deep area so the whale can stay in that area and possibly get back out. But if we put a lot of activity there, we're going to alter the animal's behavior and it can lead to being detrimental. In that case, the animal was able to go back out and do its thing.
Okay, let's get a couple more questions in. Maureen?
Sure. There's been a lot of questions in here about sound. Have there been any studies done to emit a sound that will warn the whales from the front of a vessel? So again, going back to the vessel strikes, what can we do to stop the vessel strikes? There's also some questions here about, can the ship slow down?
There's some programs that I think being developed to provide information to the crew, the captains of those vessels about the presence of whales in the area in which they're traveling. And I know it was being used out in California, and it seemed to be successful. I'm not sure if it's been implemented here, but that's one thing. It's a matter of making sure that the skippers and the crew know or are notified of the presence of whales and then to slow down. That's, I think, the most critical thing is to slow down, to give those whales a chance, particularly I mean, right whales can't move faster than 4 knots or 5 miles per hour, but humpbacks, they can, and just give them the time to get away.
Okay.
So, and
Okay,
just to follow up with that, I mean, the notification to mariners at the Coast Guard when they're reporting these events helps to make people aware of it. So getting a little bit more real-time data is important in that equation.
Good. All right, real quick, we're gonna go through a couple rapid fire ones. Lane Smith is asking, what is the average lifespan of a humpback whale?
Yeah, I mean, I've
Seven,
always read it
max.
as like 45 to 55, but we've been seeing whales. We documented a whale named Salt off Montauk this summer, who was first named, and documented in the Gulf of Maine in 1976. So
Max,
she's,
right.
at least 48, but likely much more than that. We don't know how old she was when she was documented. And other studies have even shown with like bowhead whales, I believe, that, they weren't around us long enough to determine how old they really were. We were in this, phase of whaling for centuries and centuries and centuries. And now we're starting to see, especially through photo ID work, we've seen a number already, right? Like 40-year-old whales over and over again. And, sometimes with calves and great, grand calves and so forth. So,
Wow.
undetermined. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
I mean,
undetermined,
bowhead whales
undetermined there, Lane.
Yeah, I mean, bowhead whales can live for over 200 years.
Yeah.
Okay, John Turner's asking, I'm sorry, are there abundance trends regarding smaller cetaceans that researchers are seeing in New York coastal waters? Sorry.
I don't know if anyone's looking at that, although there was someone looking in New York Harbor at bottlenose dolphins. I'm not sure.
So as far as abundance, one of the challenges that we face, and this is what we do a lot with aerial surveys, is making sure that we can collect those data and get enough sample size to be able to determine that. Right now, you're looking a little bit more on a population level. Bottlenose dolphins, we see them moving up the coast for coastal bottlenose dolphins. So we know that there are some animals that are here, but we're still at the beginning of collecting a lot of those data. So the simple answer is we're seeing more of them. What that trend is, we need more years of data to look at that variability and understand that, because one of the things that's actually falling out of the equation with the surveys that are being done in many cases are harbor porpoise. They're very hard to see. We used to see a lot of them back in 2004, 2005, the survey we did. We saw a number of them on the south shore of Long Island during the winter months, but we don't have a lot of data on that because, once again, a lot of the surveys now are focusing on the summer months for large whales. So there's work that needs to be done to answer that question. But a back of the envelope calculation is we're seeing more of these animals, and we're still seeing them in our stranding record like we have common dolphins, bottlenose dolphins. There is a seasonality or different variation from year to year about different species that we talk about much later.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question. We'd be remiss if we didn't ask this question before we close. What is your observation or viewpoint on how climate change is impacting the whale species?
Oh. That could take a while, but I
Yeah.
think,
I know, I shouldn't have saved
you
it for
know,
last,
I
I'm
guess
sorry.
maybe turn it around and say what isn't being impacted by climate change in terms of every different whale species out there. I think that's a whole other story, to be honest with you. It's affecting the distribution of water currents and prey and other stuff. But that's something that may take another hour to talk about. But it's a
I
good
think that it's the drivers that you're looking at
Yeah,
too. What drivers are
absolutely.
moving the food? Is that changing the food source because water temperature is changing the prey source of the food source that whales are eating? So it's a complex issue, but there's definitely change that's going on. And those are some of the things that a lot of these groups are all working on in different parts and being able to bring it together. I thank you for letting us talk here and even, you know, being able to see the presentation earlier and looking at some of those data helps us bring those pieces together and not work in a void.
Okay, we have so many questions in the queue. I'm sorry, we are capturing all of them, and actually we will get answers to all of them. But I really want to thank everyone for listening, for participating, and I especially want to thank both Cresley and AMC's for the dedicated professionals and the hard work that you guys are doing on marine mammal protection. It's very important that we use biological science and not political science to make policies and to get answers so that we can go into the future knowing that we are crafting plans to protect these whales and protect these species. So we appreciate your work, and we are thankful for it. And thank you for everyone for listening. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.